In the last 25 years or so, there's been between 50 and 60% decrease in male fertility. Nobody's talking about that. I mean, these are the consequences of the use of pesticides, but also other chemicals in our food system, in our environment.
It was calculated or estimated that we had 385 million cases of unintended pesticide poisonings per year globally. And 95% of them would occur in Global South countries.
The amount invested in lobbying for agriculture is bigger than in arms industry. So that gives you an order of magnitude of how serious that problem is.
What is banned in the EU is often in many cases not banned in other countries, but still European pesticide companies, German pesticide companies can continue to produce these highly hazardous pesticides and export them to other countries. And they're making big sales with it.
Aslema, welcome to Ecologia Podcast. In this episode, we are dealing with agroecology, and we are glad to have two distinguished guests, Dr. Emile Frison. He's a member and the founder of IPES-Food panel and senior advisor to the Agroecology Coalition. We are also happy to have Lena Luig. She's the head of International Agriculture Policy Department in Heinrich Böll Foundation. So they are in Tunisia as part of a green lecture organized by the Heinrich Böll Tunis office. And we are glad to have them here with us in the podcast to talk about this important topics. So just to start, I will ask both of you one question, which is, it's interesting to talk when we talk about agroecology. It's not only about technical application. It's more than that. It's a holistic approach that mixes culture, social, policy, politics, and even health. So what do you think? Let's start with you, Emile.
Well, indeed, in the past, objectives in agriculture have been about maximizing productivity and maybe maximizing profit at the expense of the environment, at the expense of health, at the expense of social equity, and total denial of cultural values. It was just maximizing profit, productivity. We know that that is not sustainable for various reasons, environmental, climate reasons, biodiversity loss, of course, the social inequity that is not acceptable and that is getting worse, in fact. So I think there is a very broad recognition of the need for a fundamental change. And that fundamental change has to be about a holistic transformation of our food systems as a whole, with objectives that combine economic objectives. Of course, it has to be economically viable and profitable. Environmental objectives in terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate resilience and adaptation. It has to bring about good health, both from a nutrition point of view, but also the other impacts that chemicals have on our health. So we have to have health objectives as well. And I think importantly, bring about social equity and move away from the injustice situation that is still prevailing today. So that is actually what agroecology is bringing. It's taking a holistic approach at delivering on all these objectives simultaneously.
Okay. Lena, when we try to think about agroecology from, let's say, a policy perspective, so there is big difference from a conventional agriculture. So how we can find this point of differences?
Yeah, so maybe just first to add on what on the other question on what Emile already just said, because I think in Europe, in Germany, I'm asked a lot, like, what's the difference between agroecology and organic farming? Because in Europe, we would have organic farming that is very strong and recognized as like a certified type of agriculture. And what I always feel is important to stress is that agroecology would definitely go beyond the farming plot. So it's about, as Emile said, it's about the whole food system and about equity in the whole food system. So it's also about the way we organize the processing on the one hand, but then also like the distribution, the retailers, for example. Like in Germany, I only know these figures for sure for Germany, but we only have 4 supermarkets controlling 85% of the market. And I guess this is very similar in France. I don't know about the situation here about the retail sector, but just to stress that it's really about the whole food system. And another difference is really that organic farming is more associated with like global north countries. I wouldn't say it was invented there, but the kind of certification that we have. Whereas agroecology is very deeply rooted in the global south, like especially in Latin America. So these are big differences I still wanted to add. And on the policies, yes, of course. I mean, most agricultural policies have really focused on this industrial model of agriculture, of maximizing the productivity. And it's really hard to like change this policy level to really foster, enhance an agroecological transition. And in many countries, what we see is still, we were talking about this earlier, a kind of coexistence between, like, on the one hand, you would still have the agricultural industry really and policies for these like bigger players. And then at the same time, you would have like certain projects or maybe at county level initiatives to engage with agroecology. And in Brazil, just to name this example, you have the most extreme form of coexistence, I would say, because you even have 2 agricultural ministries. You have an official agricultural ministry for like the big agribusiness, and then you would have like a ministry for rural development, it's called. It's basically for small scale farmers.
How can find the language to talk to each other?
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
That's the originality of the situation, and it's not uncommon. Not having 2 ministries, but actually having 2 types of policies within the same ministry. Still today, most of the countries, even those that have developed a strategy for agroecology, their predominant policy in agriculture is still about conventional, or what I would call industrial agriculture, high input agriculture. And so you have these dualities even within the same ministry, with some people that are more progressive and rethinking the needs for change, while in most cases the predominant policy is still supporting industrial agriculture.
Yeah, sure. In a country like Brazil, it's a big number of people, at least. In some level, we were thinking that agroecology cannot give enough productivity to find a solution to hunger, to feed people.
That's a story that has been told for a long time and still continues to be told today by people that have a vested interest in maintaining the current industrial model in place as much as possible. Because we have enough evidence today that agroecology can be as productive as industrial agriculture, and in cases even more productive. So that story about feeding the world no longer has any legs to stand on. What we should realize is that the enormous investment that is being made in continuing to tell these stories, in trying to influence policies at the national level to continue to support industrial agriculture, and the vested interests, the input suppliers like fertilizer companies, pesticide companies, seed companies, they all have a vested interest in maintaining the current system in place, and they are investing huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars every year, to lobby government to maintain policies that are supportive of their model of agriculture.
Yeah, it's like any lobby to protect market. I mean, so it's a huge market.
It's a huge market. And actually, the amount invested in lobbying for agriculture is bigger than in arms industry. the armament, weapons.
Okay.
We know there is a lot of lobbying going on for the weapon industry. But in agriculture, the investment is even bigger. So that gives you an order of magnitude of how serious that problem is.
And even apart from the lobbying, I would still stress that it's important to differentiate between, what actually does feed the people. And usually like the type of industrial agriculture is more export oriented, and like even staying with the example of Brazil. So the big agribusiness would mainly produce soybeans, maize, to some extent sugarcane. And these are all crops that would mainly be produced for export. So this is definitely not feeding the population within the country. Whereas we see, for example, the Brazilian landless movement, they're the biggest producer of organic rice, and rice is really a staple food in Brazil. So we also have to always ask this question, like what is actually being produced? What are the types of crops? And is it really for the domestic market to really feed the people, or to be exported?
Okay. In countries like Tunisia or North African countries, we have many family farmers, so very small scale. And in some ways, when we think about agroecology, we think like a traditional agriculture, so it's very basic. But as I understand, it's a modern way of rethinking agriculture. So agroecology, there is different principle, different way of making it as scientific as technical to get productivity, and even to make better to the soil, to the land.
Yes, the principles, the development of these principles started in 2014, and there's been a whole process coming to an agreement on first 10 elements that were then translated into 13 principles in 2019 by the high-level panel of experts of the Committee on World Food Security. These have been widely adopted in principle, but their translation in practical ways in transforming agriculture is still lagging behind. And that's partly because of what we said earlier, the influence. Also because the whole education system, agricultural education, is still very much based on an industrial model. Myself, I was educated, I'm an agricultural engineer, and then I got a PhD in agriculture, very much in this industrial model of calculating how much inputs of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium you have to put, which pesticide to use for which disease and for which insect. And so that is very much the model that the people that are later on employed by Ministry of Agriculture have as a mental model. And it's very difficult to move away from that, especially when you hear many voices that come and tell you that's the way it should be, unless we move that way, there will be problems of feeding the world, etc. So I think this education problem is one of the causes as well on why things are slow to move with the implementation of these 13 principles. And what is important about these 13 principles is that, as you mentioned, it's not just about the application in the field, about agricultural practices. It is very much about the change of society, the change of the entire food system down to consumption as well, having a better, healthy food for the consumers. And so the social dimension about equity, about social values, about participation, about involvement in governance, etc., are very important parts of these 13 principles that should guide this transformation.
Okay. Lena, one of the point when these 13 principles are in some low progress, I think it's about political recognition. So is there any policies, in the South or even in the North, that we can find agroecology principle in their constitutions or in their way of dealing in the nation level? So, I don't know, what do you think?
Yes, there are definitely more and more examples of agroecology policies and strategies. So I would give the example of Kenya. I recently visited also our Nairobi office there in February this year. And their civil society was very active in pushing for a national agroecology strategy. And they were successful last year. So the government has officially adopted a national agroecology strategy in Kenya. Although the same problem as we said earlier, there is definitely a part of the agricultural ministry that is very active in this and very in favor of agroecology, but still that doesn't mean that like the top level of government is very much pushing for agroecology. So it's still to be seen like how the implementation will go and how government will also put money into the implementation. This is of course a big issue, but the civil society is very well organized and they're very active. So this is a good thing. Similarly, in Tanzania, we have a similar development. So there's some places definitely to look at, and I think it's always helpful, like especially this South-South cooperation and learning from each other and seeing like what worked well and what not. So yeah, we also as Heinrich Böll Foundation, we're trying to connect like different partner organizations from different regions and countries to really enhance this kind of exchange and joint trying to push for these agroecology strategies.
So you mainly work with the civil society, or you work also with the political actors?
It's really it depends on the country and like how also like the political situation is, how like the relationship towards the regime is, etc. So in some contexts and countries it might be more grassroots partners. In other contexts it might be like NGOs with very good relations to ministries, etc. So it really depends, but of course the outcome, what we try to achieve in the different contexts is like as like high level political as we can get, I would say.
Okay, Emile, how much importance the role of an international network of experts, of people, of NGOs to at least to move forward in the direction of adoption of agroecological principle or way of thinking?
I think that one is always stronger when you feel that you're not alone. And that's one of the important values of networking or joining a coalition of actors. And so there are, as was mentioned, there are now many countries that have developed strategies. Some other examples: Uganda, Zambia, Senegal, Burkina Faso. In India, there are several initiatives we can come back to later on. In Latin America, there's a strong movement. But until recently, these efforts were mainly scattered, and there was no really way to bring together to have a stronger voice. And as long as these were small initiatives left and right, actually little attention was paid to it by the big corporations, because it's a small niche market. It's important to do agroecology, etc. Now that it becoming more prominent and more present in many countries, and the importance of agroecology is increasing, now they start getting nervous and start combating it. But to come back to the importance of networking and bringing people together, in 2021, an international coalition for food system transformation through agroecology was created. It was on the occasion of the World Food System Summit in 2021. And I should say on the occasion of, and not because there was a strong fight to get agroecology a voice and a space within that food system summit that was very much or too much dominated or too much influenced by private sector interests. But anyway, we managed to get agroecology visible, and one of the outcomes was that we decided to create a coalition that is quite a unique construction, because it brings together both state and non-state actors. So the members of the coalition are both governments and organizations, and different types of organizations: farmer organizations, civil society organizations, research organizations, indigenous people organizations, intergovernmental bodies like UN organizations, and philanthropic foundations. They all come together with governments on a voluntary basis to work together and try to accelerate the transformation of our food system towards more sustainable and resilient systems. And that is very much a mutual encouragement. It's seeing what we can learn from each other. So there's a lot of knowledge exchange, but even just the mutual encouragement, feeling that you are not alone, because as was mentioned, in many ministries, when setting policies, etc., the people that are supportive of agroecology are a minority, and they themselves need to be encouraged and supported. And so by this networking, they are more empowered to be more active within their own government.
How far the state members in this coalition are serious and committed?
That's a very good question, sir. It depends a lot. I think there are very active countries. First of all, the participation of the country depends. In some countries, it's the Ministry of Agriculture that has decided to join the coalition. In some northern countries, donor countries, it's sometimes the Ministry of Development Cooperation, sometimes both. In the case of Germany, it's both the Ministry of Development Cooperation and the Ministry of Agriculture that have decided jointly to join the coalition. In Ghana, it's the Ministry of Health that has decided to join, because they felt that the impact of industrial agriculture was so damaging for health that they saw an agroecological transformation as a priority. So the reason to join is different from country to country, and also the level of engagement. In some countries decided to sign on and then are not very active. Others are really very, very supportive and engaged and are trying. So besides the countries, there are also 3 regional commissions: the European Commission, the ECOWAS Commission in West Africa, and the African Union Commission, and 3 subnational governments as well: Catalonia in Spain, the Murang'a County in Kenya, and the Andhra Pradesh state. So it's also a level of infranational governments, local governments within countries that have decided to join, because a lot of the policy influence can also happen at that level.
Okay. Is there any approach like agricultural diplomacy in the international policy?
Agricultural diplomacy? That's a good question as well. So, I mean, from speaking from a German perspective again, also, I just wanted to make sure, it's interesting you mentioned Germany in joining the Agroecology coalition. And of course, it's a great success that our ministry, like the German Agricultural Ministry, also joined as an agricultural ministry. But even there, I have to admit, within the agricultural ministry in Germany, it's mostly like the international department that is working on agroecology. But for Germany, agroecology doesn't play a role, really. So there it's, again, like organic farming, which is a little different, and it's also fine and definitely should be supported. But there's this really weird separation between, like, okay, what's like national for Germany and what's international, okay, agroecology. Agricultural diplomacy. So I know that the German government has like an agricultural dialogue with, definitely with Brazil, definitely with South Africa. I don't know if there are other countries. India. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So that's definitely interesting, and sometimes there's also like a climate dialogue, and those would interact. So that's for sure an interesting part. And at the same time, of course, you have these free trade agreements, for example, European Union, Mercosur free trade agreement, which is a big topic, and in many ways those would really counteract and would go in the opposite direction again, because like usually those free trade agreements would really not would go at the expense of small scale family farming, smaller, like it's mostly about this export orientated industrial agriculture. So it's kind of divided.
Is there any talk in the kind of debt conversion from north to south through ecological project?
I mean, the debt topic is really, really important when it comes to agricultural markets and like international trade. For let's say after the invasion of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the food prices really went up very high, especially for countries, I believe, like Tunisia, that are importing the biggest part of their food. And I know of many countries, especially like sub-Saharan African countries, that have been hit very, very strongly, and this has exacerbated really a debt crisis. So there's a strong linkage between like food crisis. Actually, it's a food price crisis. It's not so much like about the offer. It's more about like the prices, really. So it's also, we need to talk about speculation there.
As well.
Yeah. So there's a strong link between food price crisis and debt crisis, of course. And that is always very important. And this is, again, an argument, I would say, to really strengthen food sovereignty and agroecological approaches, so that countries would become less dependent and more resilient in times of economic crises, economic shocks.
Okay. There's something to
there have been debt swaps for particular, sometimes environmental actions. I'm not aware of specific debt swaps for agroecology, where debt would be taken away in compensation of adopting agricultural policies that are agroecological. I'm not aware of any. I'm not saying they don't exist, but I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
That might be an approach, because debt is a problem. Too much countries that are so deeply indebted that there's virtually no way out without such an approach. And of course, agroecology is needed. So bringing the two together would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, definitely. I have a book, and I start seeing some article inside. So it's about pesticides, and it's atlas. So it's like have universal dimensions. So I want you to tell me a bit about this project, and let's start a small conversation about the role of these pesticides and the conventional agriculture, and how damage are happened to our soil.
Yeah, maybe I can start off with this format of atlas. So like Heinrich Böll Foundation, I believe the Meat Atlas in 2013 was the first of this like atlas series, and ever since we have produced one atlas per year, first in German and then an international edition in English. And by now this has really evolved as a tool that our offices around the world can really pick up and translate and add chapters, articles that really deal with the local context.
This is a Tunisian atlas, so we have many articles inside. So interesting the approach to add the countries inside.
Exactly, and like for me, it's really. It's so great to see that in the case of the pesticide atlas, it was really 14. We have 14 different international editions. So like from, I don't know, Mexico and Brazil to China, Korea, and Africa in the middle. So that's really fascinating. And I hear of many of our offices that are really working with the atlas, with local partner organizations, of course, with a lot of activities and sometimes even achieving like real output impact in terms of legislation. For example, in Nigeria and Kenya, a number of like highly hazardous pesticides have been withdrawn as a result of like a campaign by our office and our partner organizations. In the atlas, we try to put together like facts and figures about pesticide use, but also pesticide trade. I think it's always important to stress this dimension of double standards in pesticide trade. So what is banned in the EU is often in many cases not banned in other countries, but still European pesticide companies, German pesticide companies can continue to produce these highly hazardous pesticides and export them to other countries. And they're making big sales with it. So to talk about Bayer, for example, the German company that bought up Monsanto, which is still, I think, a name that many people know. So it's even more powerful now. And Bayer makes around a third of its sales with highly hazardous pesticides. Okay. And BASF, another chemical company from Germany, makes a fourth of its sales with highly hazardous pesticides. So this is really like a big business. Yeah. And this happens outside of Europe. And it contributes to the fact that we have, it was calculated or estimated that we have 385 million cases of unintended pesticide poisonings per year globally. And 95% of them would occur in Global South countries. And this is due to many factors. But one factor, of course, is that in many Global South countries, you could still use highly hazardous pesticides that have been banned in the EU or the USA or whatever.
Emile.
And there's been virtually no effort to really ensure that pesticides in general, leave alone these highly hazardous pesticides, are used properly. A lot of the use of pesticides, and of course especially highly hazardous pesticides, is done in an indiscriminate manner by farmers that are not yet educated, that are not using protective equipment, that are sometimes, mixing the product with their hand or are in direct contact with these chemicals. And so the impact is really, really tremendous. And the number of real death caused by it is also unacceptably high. But that's not the direct impact is not the only one. There's also the problem of residues in the products that are consumed by consumers. The dosage, the rates applied in many cases are far higher than what is recommended. The sales people, of course, try to recommend high rates, and there's many farmers not being educated will say, well, if 1 liter is good, let's put another one to make sure that it's working well. And so you have sometimes very high exposure in the food that is contaminated, having an impact on the health of consumers. Many of that impact is still largely underestimated. There are endocrine perturbing chemicals that are having a long-term impact at very low dosage, of which we don't know yet what the effect will be. We know already that there are impacts on our immune system, impacts on our reproductive system with very significant decrease in male fertility, for example. In the last 25 years or so, there's been between 50 and 60% decrease in male fertility. Nobody's talking about that. I mean, these are the consequences of the use of pesticides, but also other chemicals in our food system, in our environment. And I think these are things that have tremendous impact in the longer term that we should really be tackling.
Is there any international regulation, legislation, in terms of rate of pesticide or?
There are 3 binding conventions, the so-called Basel, Stockholm, and Rotterdam conventions that are dealing with international trade of pesticides. But when you look at the whole number of pesticides that are being sold globally, these 3 binding conventions would only cover 4% of these pesticides. So it's really just a fraction that is regulated internationally. And also, concerning the trade of pesticides, so we have the Rotterdam Convention that lists chemicals that are highly hazardous. But the mechanism that is obligatory through this convention is that the exporting country has to notify this export and wait for the approval of the importing country to say yes. But so this is no ban. This is no global ban on the trade of these chemicals. It's just like waiting for the importing country to approve. And of course, we know about all these power imbalances globally. So this is really not an answer. This is really not enough. So what is lacking is a global ban of highly hazardous pesticides. And there are many initiatives. So we had Pesticide Action Network as a partner for the Pesticide Atlas. They're an international network. They've been fighting for a global ban on highly hazardous pesticides for many years. There's been some successes. For example, last year at UNEA, at the UN Environmental Program or Assembly. Thank you. There was a resolution was adopted to phase out of highly hazardous pesticides by 2030, and this is important, of course, but we don't have any global treaty or anything yet. So this is something still to come, really. And we're in touch as Heinrich Böll Foundation. We're also in touch and supporting an initiative that was founded in Brazil, an International Pesticide Standard Alliance. It was founded by scientific people from academia mainly, and they're also trying to like really push for a UN treaty on pesticides. So there's a lot going on, but yeah, we really need this kind of international regulation there.
Yeah, but when we see the crisis of multilateralism actually now, so yes. I mean, I don't know if we can stay pessimist or optimist or...
Maybe before we move away from the pesticide, there are 2 more dimensions that are important to notice as well. The first one is that the assessment of the level of danger of a pesticide is assessed only by the company that sells the product.
Okay.
That's one thing. It's not done by an independent body.
It's weird.
And we know, for example, that in the case of glyphosate, since you mentioned that Monsanto knew right from the beginning that it was a potential cancer-causing chemical. And that was never revealed in the studies that were given. So companies have to make a certain number of tests to see how toxic a product is. And that information has to be provided to the regulatory body of the country or region that is approving the commercialization of the product. So it's done by the company. And of course, they release the information that they are willing to release. There are some minimal number of tests that have to be done, but it doesn't go beyond that. And the second thing is that it's only the active ingredient that is being tested. Besides the active ingredient, the chemical product that is supposed to be effective, there's a lot of other chemicals in the formulation of that pesticide to make it stick better on the plant or to make it absorb faster, etc. And those chemicals are not being tested for their toxicity, or at least they don't have to be tested. They are kept secret. It's part of the secret of the company that is selling the product. And sometimes those chemicals are even more toxic than the active ingredient itself. And that is the case with glyphosate as well, is that the formula is much more toxic than just the active ingredient. So these are 2 dimensions that one has to be aware of. There's no independent assessment of the danger of pesticide or any other chemicals, by the way. There are other dangerous chemicals in the world. And again, it's only the companies that produce them that do the minimum testing required.
Sorry, yeah. And also what I still wanted to add is that the type of regulation is not only like different from country to country when it comes to like the approval of marketing of pesticides, but also when it comes to the residues. So you were talking about residues on food, but of course residues in water is also a really big problem. So I know, again from Brazil, I don't know, I have many examples from Brazil, but there the like maximum residue level of glyphosate in water is like, I believe, 1,000 times higher than in the European Union. So also this varies a lot from country to country. And what I find so interesting is that companies like Bayer are using this like decolonial critique in order to tell like NGOs and civil society from northern countries that are criticizing Bayer that, okay, we really shouldn't tell like global south countries how to regulate their pesticides. This is a neo-colonial approach. So we would rather leave this up to like the countries, and each country can decide like what is good or bad. So those companies are really like taking this like decolonial criticism, which is of course like legitimate. But in this direction, it really doesn't make any sense because we know of, I mean, like, why would a pesticide that is an endocrine disruptor or that is carcinogenic be like cause any different effect in an African country than in a European country? So like our bodies are the same. So it really doesn't make sense to say, okay, it can be allowed in another country, but in the EU it's not allowed because it's carcinogenic.
So we need, in some ways, an international agriculture court.
This will come back to multilateralism as well. But just one more topic. We're talking here about pesticides, but there's there's also a problem with fertilizers. Recently, there's been a lot of noise about the danger of cadmium that is coming, which is a heavy metal that is present in phosphorus fertilizer, and that is poisoning not only the soil but also water and the people that eat products coming from fields that are contaminated. So it's not just about pesticides; it's the whole chemical inputs that should be questioned, and therefore an agroecological approach is even more justified than in the past. But to come back to multilateralism, we are seeing a real weakening of multilateralism, especially in the very recent past. And that is really worrying, to my view, because unless there is greater cooperation and positive engagement between different countries to try to overcome the excessive power of private sector industry, unless we have that being reinforced again, we will become more and more victim, I would say, of the power of big multinational companies.
But this kind of multilateralism, he brings with him all this ecosystem of multinational companies.
Not necessarily.
Not really. Yeah. I think multilateralism, at least the way I understand it, it's really cooperation between different countries. And there are really domains where the country governments are the only ones that should have power. I'm really preoccupied when we see that Elon Musk is able to send hundreds of satellites, and that what happened in the Ukraine war is one person decided not to provide information to Ukraine anymore based on their satellite. That's a decision that was made by Elon Musk. Such a decision should not be in the hands of one rich person. Yeah. That should be really the
not even a president.
Not even it should really be done by democratically elected governments. And not in the hands of one single person. And I think that is really preoccupying. And that's why I think there's a real need to reinvigorate multilateralism more broadly.
At this level of higher governance, so it's like crisis, and how we can imagine in the level of communities an alternative way of governance to protect and to promote at least the agroecologic way of thinking and practicing. So what do you think? What kind of, it can be commoning, it can be community, it can be economy of sufficiency. So what do you think?
Can I still add one last thing to the multilateral, or like linking like the pesticides with the UN level. So what we also found really worrying to see is that during the last FAO presidency, the now Chinese FAO president signed a memorandum of understanding with CropLife. CropLife is like the business association of the biggest 5 pesticide companies. So that was something that was really, so this is, I would say it's a weakening of the multilateral system for sure, but rather like having this approach of partnership with these very big destructive businesses. And luckily, just also to say something positive here in this podcast, this like civil society globally really engaged in this and got together and protested against this kind of partnership. So it was last year or the year before it was ended.
Last year,
right?
They withdrew from that agreement. Yeah.
So that's the success of civil society, international civil society, I would say. But this is how far like the industry influence at UN level also has come. But yeah, coming back to your question on the local level, I think the local level is really key, and I believe we saw this in many cases during the pandemic, that like structures where you had like a functioning local structure of like community gardens and also community kitchens performed way better during this like economic crisis than areas where you didn't have those kind of structures. So I'm thinking of South Africa now. There were really good examples of Cape Town suburbs where also like NGOs would help would assist really these kind of community gardens, a lot of like also empowering women to play a key role in community kitchens, etc., because there's also a lot of gender-based violence, especially when you have these type of economic crisis and people have to stay at home. And so these, in Cape Town, I remember there were really like great initiatives to really have this holistic approach of social cohesion, of food security through these community gardens, and also protect women from gender-based violence or household violence at home. I think we can really see some good examples of what worked during the pandemic, during this like extreme times of economic hardship.
And I think in general, we know that changing our food systems towards more resilient, sustainable, equitable systems requires really an integrated approach. It needs a collaboration between between authorities, whatever the level at which we are talking, between the private actors, between civil society and consumers. And that is much easier to have this kind of interaction and integration at the local level than it is at the international level. Because at the local level, people know each other better. It's easier to have talking to the shopkeepers where you're doing your shopping, rather than try to arrange an agreement at the national level where it's much more abstract. And so the importance of for example, food councils that bring together the various stakeholders to decide on food-related issues in their community, that can be very powerful way to facilitate and accelerate a transformation. And we are seeing that in many cities now. There are initiatives that are really very strongly working towards improving their food systems, towards greater equity, deciding on which kind of shops can open in which kind of neighborhoods to ensure that also in the poorer neighborhoods you have access to quality food. and not just highly processed food, like is the case, unfortunately, in many poor areas within cities. The only shops that are accessible to people that are living there and often don't have a car to go to a supermarket that is miles away from their home. They were often exposed only to shops that are selling these ultra-processed food, which is extremely damaging to the health of the people. And so trying to regulate those things, to foster collaboration, to engage in gardens, community gardens, etc. These are all processes that are much easier done at the local level. The other thing is that one of the principles of agroecology also is to have shorter value chains, to bring together consumers and producers more directly. There's a lot of efforts now to have participatory guarantee systems that is a way of certifying that the produce is produced in a way that is agroecological, that hasn't been using pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, on not an outside and costly certification system like in organic. Most of the organic agriculture is based on all organic agriculture is based on external certification. So you have a company that comes to certify your farm and check that you're doing everything okay. That's very costly. It's impossible for smallholder farmers to pay for that. It's because whether you are certifying a half-hectare farm or a 20-hectare farm, the cost is the same. Mm-hmm. And so it's impossible for smallholder farmers to do that. So there's a lot of innovation now in terms of participatory guarantee systems where it's the peer farmers in collaboration with the consumer organizations and retailers that define what is actually guaranteed, and it's on the basis of trust and a peer-to-peer control rather than an outsider. And so people don't have to pay high prices for this certification that is based on trust, which is also part of the, I would say, the philosophy of agroecology, to become much closer to human relationships rather than just being exposed to trade agreements, for example.
And this kind of financing, it's workable in bigger scale?
It is now being promoted also even by IFOAM Organics International, which is the international body association of organic farming. They realize that if they want to have more organic certified agriculture that is accessible to smallholder farmers, especially in developing countries, that they have to move away from only this external certification system. So IFOAM Organics International is also promoting participatory guarantee systems. But to do it really at an international level is very difficult because it's based on a relationship of trust. And the greater the distance, the more difficult it is to build trust. Because if you don't know the person, it's very difficult to say, I trust that system. Mm-hmm. So there's great value in also localizing much more the food system. Of course, it's not about banning international exchange. We don't want to say that you're not allowed to eat a banana in Germany because you're not producing that, or to eat strawberries in Congo because you don't produce that, etc. Trade still will play a role, but I think the majority of the food should be produced locally and have a much more direct relationship between for various reasons, environmental as well as social reasons in climate related, carbon emissions related to distance, etc.
Yeah.
And maybe just to add, a lever that I find very important from like public, like it could be government, but also local government side, is public procurement, for example, for school feeding programs or hospitals or canteens, because there you have so much power. If public institutions use that in order to prioritize local agroecological farming, this would create really such a big market, a secure market for producers. It would really incentivize agroecological transition, and this is something that is not being used enough for now. So again, in Brazil, we have the system of school feeding program, and in the school feeding program, 30%, I believe, of the produce that is bought, it needs to come from family farming. This is not necessarily agroecological, but still. So these are some examples we can really take seriously and try to apply them at a local level in as many contexts as possible, because this is the most important lever, really.
Yeah, Brazil is interesting laboratory, so you can find both sides.
Both extremes.
Also, there is the place of the will, of the political will inside the country to move forward, in this direction. So, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Interesting conversation. So, for the last word, can we still be optimistic?
I guess we have to be.
Exactly. I would use that term as well. We have to be. There are enough examples now to show that it is possible. If I can give one concrete example at scale, in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, there's now more than 1 million farmers that are practicing agroecology. It is supported by the local government that still is subsidizing also industrial agriculture, because they know that the transition to convince farmers takes time. It's a system based on farmer-to-farmer peer learning. And that's a social process that does take time, but they have the firm intention to convert all the farmers, or the vast majority of the farmers, towards agroecology. And a recent scientific study on the performance of that agroecology, comparing farmers that are still maintaining industrial agriculture with pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, compared to the ones that are practicing agroecology, have shown that the agroecology is 11% in average, 11% more productive, not less, that it is 50% higher net income. There is 33% less expenditure on health in households that practice agroecology compared to those that use chemical agriculture, and 1/3 less days of work because of sickness. There's 50% more biodiversity in terms of birds and insects in the fields that are agroecological. So there are many co-benefits besides just even the economic dimension of productivity and net income, but also on the health and on the environment.
Livelihood.
The evidence is there, so that's what makes me hopeful that we will manage to move forward. We have to realize that there are strong forces try to slow that down, but if we all work together, and that's why I think the coalition is important. And yesterday I invited Tunisia as a country to join the coalition as well, where 51 countries are already present. So I think if we all join forces, we must make that happen.
Okay, thank you. Lena, the last word.
Yeah, also, we have to be optimistic. I guess we have no choice. But I would say, sometimes for me, it's hard to be optimistic looking at these big companies that are so powerful. But at the same time, as Emile was saying, those companies trying to lobby against agroecology also means that the agroecological movement internationally has somehow become a threat. And we can also interpret this as a good sign, right? Yeah. So I remember, Emile probably has been working on agroecology for decades. So I started about 8 years ago working on agroecology and pesticides. And since then, I do see the change that, at least within our universe, of course, this is not out in the streets, but within our universe, agroecology already has become so mainstream and everybody's talking about agroecology. We still need to make this happen, but there's definitely, I feel optimistic talking to so many people engaged in this field, and we should continue to join forces, really.
Yeah, I'm with you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure indeed.